Which countries grow faster economically, those with strong beliefs in heaven and hell, or those with weak beliefs in them? This is one of the many questions that Rachel McCleary and Robert Barro tackle in their new book, The Wealth of Religions. Today, the authors are here with us to tell us more about their book, why they wrote it, and what they have discovered. Rachel McCleary is a lecturer and writer. She holds a PhD in philosophy from the University of Chicago, a Master of Theological Studies from Emory University, and a BA from Indiana University. Her research focuses on how religion interacts with economic performance and the political and social behavior of individuals and institutions across societies. She also studies how religious beliefs and practices influence productivity, economic growth, and the maintenance of political institutions, such as democracy. And Robert Barro is Paul M. Warburg Professor of Economics at Harvard University, a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, and research associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research. He has a PhD in economics from Harvard University and a BS in physics from Caltech. Well, some of his recent research involves rare macroeconomic disasters, corporate tax reform, religion and economy, empirical determinants of economic growth, and economic effects of public debt and budget deficits. Recent books include Religion and Economy with Rachel McCleary, Economic Growth, his second edition with Javier Salai Martin, and Nothing is Sacred, Economic Ideas for the New Millennium, among others. We are ever so honored to have you here, Rachel and Robert. We are very pleased to be talking to you this day. And so I think the first question is for both of you. How did you come up with the idea for writing this book?
Well, we've been teaching a course at Harvard for several years and running a seminar series on the political economy of religion. We started it in 2003. And it was very popular. This is a whole new subfield in economics. So we were kind of forging ahead. We kind of took over where sociologists had been working. Mm-hmm. And we were more interested in beliefs as opposed to social organization, cults, and how you join groups, how are they structured. We were interested in the effect of beliefs on people's productivity and economic performance. So that's how we kind of got started on this.
Also, I had been working for some time on empirical determinants of economic growth, particularly across countries. And I came to believe that the determinants there involved a large array of factors, not just narrow economic considerations, but also elements of culture and maybe religion. So that got me interested thinking particularly about the connection of economic growth with religion. And of course, Rachel had a lot of strength in thinking about dimensions of religion and how beliefs and participation might matter. So I think our different lines of inquiry kind of came together in terms of our early work, thinking about religion as a factor that influenced economic growth.
You actually set up my second question, because I was going to ask you, Robert, about this. I know you've been interested in religion and as a determinant or of economic growth or not. And I read in the book, it says that religion can promote economic growth, though the religious beliefs and practices imparted through its the religious beliefs and practices imparted to its adherents. So what are the difficulties of measuring? I've always been curious, how do you measure the way that religion can impact economic growth, and what have you learned?
A lot of our ideas in this realm came initially from Max Weber in terms of his analysis of the Protestant ethic and why it might have mattered, particularly during the Industrial Revolution and influencing which European countries started to grow first, started to adopt new industry and become more productive. So that was kind of a general framework. A lot of the things we measured came from these large international surveys, like the World Value Survey being an example, where they would find out about people's religious beliefs. You already mentioned belief in hell, belief in heaven, belief in an afterlife. So those measures come from, particularly from these surveys of individuals in terms of what they believe. And those data sources also had information about participation, like in formal religious services, for example, which is more a measure of the social interaction. So we looked at that along with the beliefs. And we took Weber's view, being more focused on beliefs as an influence on economic outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, this next question is for both of you. And I think that many members of Instituto Fe y Libertad might be even a little shocked to read this when you mention that religion is a market. What do you mean by that? And it's for both of you.
Well, we get that idea from Adam Smith, from The Wealth of Nations. And we take two fundamental principles that people are rational actors, that they choose the religion that they want to belong to. Of course, people are born into religions, but they also make a choice to stay in that religion once they're adults. They also choose the level of participation in the religion. So if a person feels that they can't leave the religion, you may find that they become free riders in a sense. They minimize their participation in the religion and invest their talents in something else. The other part of Adam Smith that we take is that there is a supply and demand, that it is a free market, and that there are goods that are being priced in the market. So you have religious goods that are being priced and people will buy them accordingly.
You know, we also think that religion as a market is influenced by interventions coming from governments. There's more freedom of religion in some places than in others. Some countries have state religions and some don't. So that influences the nature of the religion products that are available to people in those countries. Adam Smith particularly focused on that. He thought that state religion that he was familiar with at the time in England was adverse because it promoted a monopoly situation where the service quality wasn't very good and people got disinterested in religion. So that's another aspect of religion as a market, but not necessarily a completely free market by any means.
Mm-hmm. That is really interesting because different countries have different policies for religion, and I think there are even countries that subsidize religion based on the number of people that attend services. So that would be really detrimental, I think, to the freedom of practice. So,
mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's a difference between regulation of religion, for mm-hmm. example, restricting, for example, where you can build your temple or your church, and then you have subsidies, for example, in the Scandinavian countries where they actually subsidize the education of ministers, Sunday schools, those types of things. So there is a difference, and they have different effects on how a religion plays out in a country.
You know, another related consideration is many countries, the prominent religion uses dimensions of the theology to influence other things that people can do. For example, Muslim countries tend to restrict not only credit markets, which is fairly well known in terms of banking and such, but also the role of corporations, the nature of insurance. There are various restrictions that can come when there's a dominant religion that spills over into effects on an array of economic and social activities. And we think many of those interventions are really negative for economic progress, particularly over the longer term.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There's also a part in the book where you mention how you can apply the theory of club goods to understanding religion, or maybe I should say organized religion. Can you explain that?
Yeah. So the club model was developed in an economic sense by Larry Iannacone in his dissertation under Gary Becker at the University of Chicago, and it's come to have different. It's been expanded a lot over the years by different generations of scholars, but the basic idea is that a club model is that you join a group because you're going to get certain benefits from it. And one of the benefits that you really want is you want high participation level. You don't want free ridership. So the idea is that if you go to church, you want everybody clapping and singing and praying, because everybody shares in that high level of intensity, spirituality. So a club model tries to keep out those people who are going to free ride it, who aren't going to participate, every day. They're not going to sing or clap or what have you. But the idea is that you have sacrifices that people make to join that group. So this came out of the 60s when cults were very popular. You had Maharishis coming to the United States who were bringing a very different, radical type of religion that wasn't a Christian religion. And then people kept saying, well, how can our children be joining this cult? They have to be brainwashed. And Larry Iannacone said, no, they're not being brainwashed. It's a very rational decision. They want to participate in a group that gives them a lot of spiritual fulfillment that they can't find otherwise in other groups. So there's a high sacrifice to joining that group. And there's also deterrence to keeping people out. For example, you have to wear a certain type of colored robe, or you have to have a certain haircut. So when you think of Orthodox Judaism, yes, that keeps people out. I mean, that's rather strict. So strictness is actually good for the people who want to join that club.
Very, very interesting. There's also an idea that you address in the book that I think is one of the most interesting things when you study religion, and it's that a lot of people believe that religion causes violence or even wars, or that a lot of the wars that we've seen in recent history are induced by religious beliefs, and a follow-up to that belief is that the more secular the society, the less violent it will be, or the more peaceful it will be, because we won't be fighting over these ideas. And when you talk about the strictness of groups, you do mention that might create a distinctiveness or separation and maybe even antagonism. Could you talk about this conception? Do religions really bring us apart or tear us apart?
Well, one example of that is the time after the Reformation in Europe, which was in the early 1500s. And it really involved a competition between Catholicism and the new upstart religion being Protestantism. And that went on for more than a century and a half, and there were a lot of religious-based wars in Europe. So most of those had their origin in some kind of competition between Catholicism and Protestantism. And following the Reformation, there was the Counter-Reformation, with the Catholic Church basically trying to eradicate the competition in terms of Protestantism. So that ended by the late 1600s in terms of having a kind of peaceful accord. So I would say, particularly in Western Europe, that was no longer a factor inducing that kind of violence. But it certainly was true over a fairly lengthy historical period that was the case. And then you can find other examples of religion having some element of inducing violence rather than eliminating it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Does that answer your question, Carol? Are we getting it there?
Yes. I've always felt, though, that in order to go to war, you sort of need the government and a sort of a military machinery and that sometimes religion is an excuse or it's not the real reason people are going to war. That there are political motivations like gaining territory or something else, and religion is that you could even apply Bruce Yandel's theory of the Baptists and the bootleggers sort of to these phenomena. But it's a very I think it's one of the most interesting things that we should address if we believe in God, that at least I think Judeo-Christian principles promote peace, or they would seem to be against war. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think you're right on the whole. I think there are examples of cases where religion was in part responsible for conflict, but I don't think it's the overall picture by any means. And certainly there's the element that you just described, which would be going in the opposite direction. I mean, if you think about the Mideast now, though, and you think about conflict between Israel and Muslim states, there's no way to get around the fact that religion is a central element in those conflicts. I mean, even if you can't have wars without states, they can still be influenced in terms of the extent of their hostilities by religious dimensions. And sometimes I think that that's accurate.
Mm-hmm. I think there are two elements here about a religion that will play into what you're referring to as the political motivation. And the first one is monopoly. So usually a religion, if it's really seeking a monopolistic status, it will then bring into its argument concepts like heresy. It will start making a very clear definition of right and wrong. So, for example, when I was studying Tibetan Buddhism, and I wrote a paper with Leonard Vanderkap about the Dalai Lama's group, that what they call the Yellow Hats, when his group finally, the Gelugpa sect, finally gained prominence in Tibet, they were violent. They were initially violent. The monks would give up their vows to fight to gain the territory. But part of this whole reasoning to allow for violence was that their founder, Tsongkhapa, had the truth, and that Buddha had spoken to him through a dream. And in that dream, he had the truth. And so you see, when religions get like that, they begin to justify political moves. Mm-hmm. And you find this repeated again and again throughout history, that heresy plays a very fundamental role in justifying violence. And we see that in the Middle East. We see that a lot with ISIS, that in fact, they have internal struggles because the younger recruits are more religious than the previous recruits, and they really want to hinge on heresy. That motivates them very strongly.
Mm-hmm. That's my next question. I wanted to because you have a full chapter on Islam and economic growth, and I think a lot of people are indeed afraid, I think, of Islamic fundamentalism and at least the terrorist version of Islam. So could you talk a little bit more about that? I'm sorry I interrupted you, Robert.
Oh, just to go back for a moment, I was initially quite surprised by Rachel's work on the history of Tibetan Buddhism, which I hadn't really been familiar with. I mean, there's a general image that Tibetan Buddhism is a very peaceful
well, it is now.
Institution. But the long ago history doesn't really look like that. There was a lot of fighting among these alternative groups, which were basically providing a similar product, but they were trying to compete to monopolize the market. And there was a good deal of violence as part of that in terms of the rise of Tibetan Buddhism as effectively the state religion of Tibet. So people are quite surprised about that history of violence going back a long way in time, but most people are not familiar with that. And I was certainly not.
Well, just to underscore this point, there's prior to the invasion of the Muslims of Europe, there was Catholics and Protestants were fighting among each other. But when they realized that the Muslims were invading, then they came to a peace, and they decided they were going to join forces to fight the Muslims. So you have the Crusades, and you have so you have a similar idea going on there, that you want to have your religion be the monopoly religion. So we're all Christians, so we're going to do it against the Muslims, and it's very interesting. It plays out again and again. Anyway, so Robert
is very interesting.
Yeah, Robert will talk to the rise of our chapter on Islam.
On Islam, yes.
Yeah.
So I think some of the best historical research on the economic implications of the Muslim religion is from Timur Kuran. And he's made the case that in comparison with the time around the year 1000, 1100 or such, the Muslim countries were basically in a strong position at that point, militarily, but also in terms of economic development. And in terms of encouraging things that looked like inventive activity, they were in pretty good shape. But his argument is that the institutions changed a lot over time and tend to become more restrictive and tend to become more protecting the sort of established hierarchy in terms of the Muslim religion. And he particularly looks at these institutional features related to things like credit markets, insurance, the role of the corporation. And he argues that that became especially important at the time of the Industrial Revolution, when it became central to have large-scale enterprises in order to exploit economies of scale and the productivity advances. And then the restrictions on corporate form that were present related to Islam, he argues, became particularly negative in terms of economic development. And that was the time when the West really became much superior in terms of economic development compared with the Muslim world. So in that sense, relatively recently, but it fits together well in terms of restrictiveness related to the religion that impinges on certain economic opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
So the more the more freedom we have, and the more religion is also a market, the better. That would seem that the more economic growth we would probably get. Would that be a good conclusion? Yes.
Yeah.
Well, he focused on institutional features, but a particularly compelling aspect of his argument is that these features became more important in an interaction with the Industrial Revolution, that it became more of a negative factor for the Muslim world than it had been previously. The restrictions were sort of the same, but in terms of what the content was, in terms of mattering, the argument is that it became more important in conjunction with large-scale industrial enterprise, which is very hard to sustain without these things like legal institutions related, for example, to corporate structure. And the alternatives that were available, these WAFs, for example, in the Muslim world, became increasingly limited in terms of how they could support this expansion of economic activity. That was his argument.
Very interesting. And then you have another really interesting chapter called "When Saints Come Marching," and we've talked about this at another time with Rachel. But it's on the economic incentives to promote people to the altars, right, within the Catholic Church. Well, saints were regular people who lived their lives virtuously. And they set an example for the faithful, right? Ways that you should be living or leading your lives. And I think they help us, they motivate us to behave better, right? Within the Catholic Church. But it's also true that probably identifying people who are not from the medieval times, but more recent saints, is probably also a good thing, in the sense that, well, if they were able to do it within the 20th century, then I should be able to lead a virtuous life as well, but what you talk about in your chapter is that there's also a market for saints, right? Could you tell us a little bit about what you found?
Well, kind of the focus, the pivot came with Pope John Paul II, and he streamlined the bureaucratic process within the Curia, the Congregation for the Causes of Saints. He made it easier to become a saint by eliminating miracles, the number of miracles, I guess simplifying it is the best way without going into too many details. But Pope John Paul well understood that Latin America in particular had been referred to as the Catholic continent. And he understood that particularly Pentecostalism was making inroads into Latin America. We also have to understand the context that there was a shortage of priests in Latin America, and there still remains a shortage of priests. So Pope John Paul understood that in order to compete with Pentecostalism and forms of charismatic movements that were outside the Catholic Church at that time, that he thought that creating more beatifieds and canonizing more people from that area or from regions of the world that had been left out of the list of saints, that he would be able to recall people back. Because you have to understand that the people that converted to Pentecostalism were previously Catholic. So there was a drain on Catholicism. If you call it the Catholic continent, then where were they coming from? They were coming from Catholicism. So he understood this very well, and he tried to set up a situation in which people would come back to Catholicism. So he made the process simpler. And he also, when he named beatifieds or canonized somebody, he would go to that region. He would go to that country and engage in the beatification. So he was grounding it within that socio-historical, anthropological context. And he was saying, this is your saint. This is for you. And he was very effective. He was incredibly effective at what he did. So we see that what he had done was he had a huge number, more than all of his predecessors, his beatified and canonized, a huge number, which created a backlog for the other popes. And Robert can speak to that. I'll give him some time.
So we think of this as a part of this general idea about competition. And in this case, Catholic Church trying to compete against the rise of especially evangelical Protestantism, Pentecostalism. So we think that local saints are particularly inspiring to people in terms of remaining within their faith and not converting out, which became a particular concern. So we've looked at that a lot quantitatively. As Rachel said, John Paul II particularly changed the process. Some people in the church hierarchy think he went way too far, that it was kind of a cheapening of the currency because it became too easy to become a saint because of the vast numbers involved. But we don't actually have that view. We think it's been a clever strategic device to try to maintain interest and fidelity of the members of the church. We think it's been effective. And another interesting dimension of that, most of our analysis up to recently was about regular saints, which are referred to as confessors. But we've also been looking now particularly at martyrs, who differ primarily in the fact that they're supposed to die in connection with hatred of the church, typically being murdered by somebody. So we're looking now at the role of martyrs, and actually Pope Francis is particularly keen on naming martyrs. He's dramatically expanded that dimension of sainthood. So in that respect, differing somewhat from the legacy of John Paul II. So we're looking now at the implications of that.
Yeah, and I think Francis has been particularly bold in unlocking or unblocking cases like Oscar Romero, Archbishop Oscar Romero, that had been blocked because people could not separate out the political motivation from the religious motivation. And Francis was very clear that this was a religious statement. It was not a political statement on the part of Oscar Romero. And even though it was controversial, he was willing to unblock it. So you begin to see that Francis is moving into very interesting territory. Like, for example, the beatifications that just took place in Guatemala. Now, some people would find that rather difficult to take, because the priest from Joyaba was actually involved in a rebel group. He actually went to Nicaragua to be trained, and he came back, but yet he's beatified now as part of the Catholic Church. And Francis said, well, look, our faith takes place within a context. I mean, he's been very bold. And I think it's very interesting to see how this is going to play out within the church.
Another dimension of this is about the Spanish Civil War. Most people don't realize how much violence there was directed against the Catholic Church, and particularly priests. And especially in 1936, during the Spanish Civil War, there were thousands of priests who were murdered. And I think it was partly suppressed because it was done by the Republican side, not by the fascists. And the Catholic Church agreed not to name anybody as a martyr, I think, for a period of 50 years. I think that was under Pope Paul VI. So that expired in 1986. And since then, the Catholic Church has been naming a tremendous number of martyrs among people who were killed during the Spanish Civil War. So it's already in the multiple thousands, and is likely to go to about 7,000 or so, which is the number estimated to have been killed, something on that order.
Yeah, in our data set of martyrs since 1588, half of them are now from the Spanish Civil War, which is very impressive, because if you think about the Japanese martyrs, the groups of Japanese martyrs, those were huge groups that were beatified, and this surpasses that. This just is amazing. What the popes have been doing since John Paul II to beatify, to recognize what had happened in Spain. Yeah,
I think it's relevant and historically important to that what you are doing and sort of bringing to the fore the numbers, because I think persecution of people of faith has continued, throughout history. And sometimes we think, well, it happened in the Roman Empire during, right after Jesus was crucified, but it continues to happen. And it's and sometimes even in countries that we think of as Catholic or as very Christian, that this has happened. So what you guys are revealing about, I think, about Latin America, I think it's very important, the tension between the different Christian groups and what it's doing to religious practice. It's important. So thank you so much. I just wanted to close with this question about are Judeo-Christian values, teachings, and principles compatible with the ideas of political and economic freedom? This is what we are trying to do in Instituto Fe y Libertad, is to show that it is possible to be someone of faith and also believe in liberty and in free markets. So could you address that question?
Well, in our work on economic growth, we look at these two dimensions that we've already referred to a bit. One is about religious beliefs, and the other one is about more formal participation in a religion. So on the belief side, following the ideas from Max Weber, we particularly thought about religion as promoting things like work ethic and thrift and honesty, charity, openness to strangers. So a lot of attractive traits we think are associated with religious beliefs. And we think our findings about religious beliefs promoting economic growth, rather than so much how often do you go to church. So we think that that's some evidence that these kinds of attractive beliefs fostered by religion actually do have an economic payoff. So I think this is very much consistent with what you said in terms of also being consistent with democracy and freedom. We don't see that there's any contradiction there between these kinds of religious beliefs and things that you would think of as economic, social, political freedoms.
Mm-hmm. And I want to underscore the virtue of charity, because as a Judeo-Christian principle, what that does is it makes you be open to strangers. And in countries that aren't quite as open to strangers, they don't engage in trade, they don't engage in exchange of ideas. I think Francis Fukuyama had a book on this, where he talked about societies that are much more open to strangers and engaging with them. Well, that's definitely a fundamental aspect of a free market, is to be able to engage in exchanges, financial exchanges with them, communication, different types of activities. And I think that the Judeo-Christian tradition certainly promotes that.
Well, thank you ever so much, both of you, for participating in this transmission, and thank you for your research and your work. I hope we can help promote it in Latin America, and that you can come and talk to us in person sometimes.
Oh, thank you. That would be great.
Yeah,
We'd love that. Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you, Kara.
Thank you so much. Instituto Fe y Libertad is an independent research center whose mission is to further human flourishing and by promoting individual liberty and Judeo-Christian principles. And you can find out more about the Institute and our work at our website, www.feylibertad.org. And we also invite you to visit our social media programs. So thank you for joining us, and keep a lookout for our next week's transmission. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.